Hiya kids, this is Ivan. This is the first in a rather self-indulgent series where I'm going to talk about my rules for playing old school Dungeons & Dragons. And like I've mentioned before on some other videos and forums, I play a game that tends to be a bit of a mishmash between first edition and basic, along with a whole bunch of rules that I've stolen and modified from other games, and even some rules from Pathfinder that I found kind of appealing. So today I'm going to talk about ability scores and ability score modifiers. Now first off, I limit what you get from 3 to 18, just like you would have normally. I don't really let you have scores like 19, even if you have some kind of racial modifier, just because with the modifiers I use, it would be a little bit too high, and because to me, scores of 19 and up are really for superhumans. And if you have like some kind of magic thing that happens to you, step in a magic pool or whatever, great, then you get some really neat scores. But for the most part, 3 to 18, what you roll is what you get. Now, I don't use racial minimums and maximums like they do in first edition. And likewise, I don't use any kind of maximums for female characters. I just don't see the need to do that sort of stuff. And I don't use the age modifiers that they use in first edition. So pretty much what you roll is what you get. I do stick with the ability score requirements for the classes in first edition. So like if you want to play a paladin, you better have a charisma of 17. Otherwise, go play a fighter. Now I could say a lot more about the classes and races, but that's really for another installment. Now, as far as character generation is concerned, I prefer the 4d6 drop lowest method. I find that gives you a very usable character in most cases. And depending on what we're doing, if we really need a mix of classes, or you really have your heart set on playing one of the 4 core classes, or we just need another fighter, whatever, I'll let you adjust them to tastes. And I'm not heartless. And should you roll a really, really crappy character, we're going to laugh a lot and make fun of you, and then I'll let you roll another one. Unless you really want to play that character, in which case it's probably never going to die, because Murphy's Law just lets you know that the worse your scores are, the more immortal your character becomes. Now, even though my game is first edition based, I really don't like those scores. After using them for years and years, I just found that they were too complex. I don't like percentile strength. They're a little wonky. And they're hard to remember, and they're really hard for people to learn that are just learning to play the game. And I play with a lot of either new players who've never played any kind of RPGs at all, or people that are used to playing some of the modern games. I also kind of looked at the modern game scores, and I kind of rejected those mostly because the midpoint, where you have no modifier at all, was just too narrow, and I didn't think that really mimicked what a normal population distribution would be like. I also like the fact that it's easier than with first edition scores to get a slight negative when you're using basic scores. Not that I want to gimp your character or mine, but I've had some of the best times playing some characters that had a couple really good scores with some bonuses, and one score where they had a slight disadvantage. I thought that added a little bit of flavor, different strokes for different folks, but I like it. What I find most appealing about the Modifier modifiers, the basic modifiers, is they mimic what a actual standard population distribution would be like in terms of standard deviations. They don't do it perfectly mathematically, but they do a pretty good job. And for those of you that don't know what the modifiers are, if you have a 3, it's a -3. If you have 4 or 5, it's a -2. If you have 6, 7, or 8, you have a -1. There's a big gap in the middle, so if 9 through 12, you're normal, so you have a 0. If you have a 13 through 15, you get a +1. If you have a 16 or 17, it's +2. And of course, 18 is +3. Anything above that, 19 and up, it's an additional plus for each score. And likewise, for anything below 3, it's an additional negative for each score until a score of 0, in which case you're probably dead. Now, this ability score modifier ends up affecting a lot of stuff, just like it would in some of the newer games. So it affects melee to hit and damage from thrown weapons, number of languages you can learn, adjustments to your armor class, range attack, your hit point modifiers, and the adjustment to the reactions of other people to your character. Now, I also have the dexterity modifier affect initiative rolls as a straight modifier rather than the kind of truncated modifier they used in Mold-V Basic, just because I use D10 initiative rather than D6. Now, I also have this ability score modify some other stuff relevant to the ability in question. And unlike the standard basic motif where wisdom affects all your magic saves, or the first edition motif where wisdom would affect your saves versus charm type magic, and dexterity would affect your saves to reflex, stuff like traps and jumping out of the way of the fireballs and all that kind of junk. I actually used something I stole from Castles and Crusades, where all 6 ability score modifiers affect some saves, because I really think that's neat to keep all the different scores relevant. But I'm going to discuss that more in my saving throw installment. Now, there's some things that really aren't set up to be modified by the straight ability score modifier. The amount you can carry and how much that affects your movement rate, your encumbrance and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't really easy to translate from the first edition percentile strength thing, so what I ended up using were the scores from Pathfinder. And they're really close to what the first edition things were, and it kind of gives you like a light, medium, and heavy load and how it affects your movement. And so I use those. The chance to know a spell and the minimum and maximum number of spells that like an arcane caster, like a wizard, can use based on intelligence are something I use straight out of first edition. So that's what I use for intelligence there. And I'm still considering tweaking them just a little bit. And I'm one of those heretics, so don't throw rocks at me, that allow magic users, even in first edition, to learn extra spells based on their intelligence scores. So because of that, I use the same tables that they would use for wisdom when it comes to clerics and extra spells they could learn. The chance of spell failure for divine spells for clerics I still use from first edition. And like I just said, I give them the extra spells based on high wisdom right out of the first edition player's handbook. Now, speaking of the magic installment, I don't strictly use the by-the-book restrictions where clerics need a 16 wisdom to cast 6th level spells and 18 to cast 7th level spells. And likewise, I don't use a thing where magic users need a 12 intelligence to cast 6th level spells, a 14 to cast 7th level spells, a 16 to cast 8th, and an 18 to cast 9th level spells. Instead, what I use is a chance of spell failure. If they don't have the right intelligence or wisdom, they can still try, but there's a good chance it might fail. And so, like I said, that's my spells installment. The dexterity modifiers for thief skills I use straight out of the first edition player's handbook. I'm considering them tweaking them a little bit, and there's a little modifier I'll talk about at the end that I might replace those with. I use the first edition player's handbook stats for system shock and resurrection when it comes to constitution. Now the reaction, the loyalty base, the morale, and stuff like that, if they're lower than the first edition modifiers when you use the mold day basic, just +3 for 18 or whatnot. But they end up being about the same because in the mold day basic thing, I use the 2d6 or sometimes 1d12 thing for like morale, reaction rate, and stuff like that. So it comes out to be just about the same. So even though those high scores were attractive in first edition, I threw them out and I just used the standard +1, +2, +3. And that works really well. If anything, it might be a little bit more powerful when it comes to reactions than the standard first edition. Now, I also use a house rule I alluded to a little bit where I modify some percentage chance rolls based on your ability score. And these are things like bend bars, lift gates, and I'm thinking about thief skills with this. And pretty much what it does is it ranges from a -15% adjustment at 3 to a +15% adjustment at 18. And for every score, they go up by 2%. Now, this has the weird effect of having no score that gives you a 0 modifier. So a 10 would give you a -1 modifier, and an 11 would give you a +1 modifier. This really doesn't bug me that much because the dead midpoint of 3 to 18 is 10.5. So the average guy is, in my game, has a 10.5 unless I really need to stat him. And if you're really astute, you will notice that a 13 in this thing would give you a +5% chance on a percentage score thing, which is, oh my god, equal to a +1 on a d20 roll. Likewise, a 60 will give you a +11, which is really close to +10, which would be a +2 on a d20 roll. There it is again. And an 18 gives you a +15, which is just like getting a +3. So it kind of mimics the d20 modifiers a little bit. So I'm having some fun messing around with that percentage chance thing. Now, there's a lot of other mechanics you can use to keep all the ability scores relevant, not just to have the modifiers. And there's things like, where you have to roll under an ability score to, as an ability check to do something like, if you don't want to slip on a greasy floor, you have to roll under your dexterity, that sort of thing. And there's even some things where you maybe have opposed rolls where you both roll, but you add your entire ability score to that roll, that d20 roll or whatever it is. So that keeps those scores relevant. Now, last but not least, I never used the comeliness stat in first edition. I thought it was a little bit wonky, but because I really sincerely feel that charisma is based on force of will and not on looks at all, I'm really kind of toying around with just having people roll a straight 3d6 for looks like they do in Hackmaster Basic. Now, this really wouldn't affect anything. There'd be no mechanic based on it. but I think it'd be kind of funny to see just how ugly your character is.